Look, usually we ease you into these things. We give you the backstory, we set the stage, we hold your hand a little bit.
Not today.
Yeah, not today. Today we are going strictly Black Diamond. If you are listening to this, we are assuming you are already well down the rabbit hole on the Flavian thesis. We're assuming you understand the typological mapping between Jesus and Titus, and you aren't afraid of the idea that the Gospels were essentially weaponized wartime propaganda.
Exactly. We are skipping the one-on-one class entirely today. We aren't going to sit here and explain that the Son of Man coming on the clouds was a reference to a Roman legion. You know that. You know the code.
Okay.
What we are doing today is answering the single biggest objection to that theory. I mean, the objection that keeps mainstream academics sleeping safely at night.
The missing countermove. That is the sticking point, right?
Huh.
I've had so many arguments with people about this work, and they always pivot to exactly this. They say, okay, if the Gospels are a satire of the Jewish war, if it's this massive dark Roman joke where they map Jesus' ministry directly onto Titus's military campaign, surely Jewish intellectuals of the time would have noticed.
That's the argument, yes.
They say surely the rabbis of that era or the generation right after would have looked at this theology and said, hey, wait a minute, that is not a Messiah. That is a literal parody of our national defeat. Where is the pushback?
It's the dog that didn't bark argument. The silence of the victim is somehow taken as proof that no crime was ever committed. People argue that if the Flavian signature is real, where is the Jewish response? Where's the intellectual defense? Where is the antivirus?
Well, buckle up, because we found it. Or rather, we are looking at a forensic audit of a text that has literally been hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years. We are talking about the Sefer Josippon.
Now, for the uninitiated, though, again, we're assuming you're pretty savvy if you're with us. The Sefer Josippon is usually just dismissed by mainstream historians. They call it medieval folk history.
It's just a bad copy.
Right, a bad copy. It's a 10th century Hebrew chronicle, likely written in southern Italy, that retells the history of the Second Temple period. And for centuries, the Academy has looked at it and said, oh, well, it's just a sloppy translation of Josephus. The scribes were careless, they got names wrong, they mixed up dates, they changed historical details simply because they didn't know any better.
Transmission noise. That is the polite academic way of saying utter incompetence.
Exactly.
But what we are proposing today, and what the data we are looking at strongly suggests, is that those errors aren't errors at all. They are patches. We are framing the Yosippon not as a broken history book, but as a deliberate, highly forensic antivirus protocol.
That is the perfect analogy. Think of Josephus's original text, The Jewish War, as the carrier file. It contains the virus being the typological code that links Titus to Jesus. That's the setup.
The Trojan horse.
Yes. And the Yosippon is the software patch designed to neutralize that virus while saving the underlying operating system, which is Jewish history itself.
So the mission for this deep dive is to conduct a side-by-side forensic audit. We are going to look at the specific nodes where the Flavian signature exists in Josephus. Then we are going to look at how the Josippon handles those exact same nodes. And I think by the end of this hour, you're going to see that the divergences in the Josippon are absolutely not random. They are surgical strikes.
And this matters because it validates the whole thesis in a way that nothing else really can. You don't build a complex antivirus for a virus that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
If we can prove that a medieval Jewish scribe deliberately edited out the typological parallels to the Gospels, then we prove that the scribe knew the code.
He saw the joke.
He saw the joke, he understood the architecture of the propaganda, and he decided to kill it.
Let's get into the mechanism first. We need to be really precise here. When we talk about the Flavian signature, we are talking about sequential typology.
Right. This is the engine of the satire. We aren't just talking about vague thematic similarities. It is a structural lockstep. Event A in the Gospel maps exactly to Event A in the Jewish War. Event B maps to Event B. The locations, the context, and often the specific vocabulary are shared between the two texts. It's like a zipper.
And for that zipper to close smoothly, for the propaganda to actually work on the human mind, you need 3 distinct conditions. First, specificity. The parallels have to be unique enough to be decodable. Second, deniability. It has to pass as sincere religion to the uninitiated masses. But the third one is the kicker here, the integrity of the source text.
This is the critical vulnerability in the Roman design. The system entirely relies on Josephus being untouched. The Gospel is the lock, and the Jewish War is the key. If I hand you a key, it only opens the door if the ridges are cut exactly right.
Right.
If you file down one ridge, or if you add a bump where there shouldn't be one, the key doesn't turn. The joke fails.
So I want you to imagine You are a Jewish intellectual in the 10th century. You are living in Christendom. You speak Hebrew, but you probably know Latin or Greek. You read the Gospels maybe just to know your enemy or for debates. And you read Josephus, because he is literally the only historian who recorded the fall of your temple. And suddenly, looking at both texts, you see it.
It clicks.
It clicks. You see that the Christians are using your history book to prove their theology. You realize that Josephus has been booby-trapped from the start. But you can't just burn Josephus because then you lose your own history. You lose the memory of Masada, of Gamla, of the famine. So what do?
You hack the file, you keep the overarching narrative, but you change the highly specific details that anchor the typology. You file down the ridges of the key so it no longer fits the lock.
That is the counter-strategy. The authors of Josippon didn't just rewrite history for entertainment or out of ignorance. They were actively dismantling a weapon. They realized that if you break the sequence, or if you alter the specific imagery in Josephus, the gospel mapping completely falls apart. The Christ stops looking like Titus and starts looking like, well, nothing. The parallel just vanishes into thin air.
And that leads us to the thesis statement for this discussion. The Josippon is the evidence of the crime. The sheer precision of these edits proves the reality of the signature. This isn't random historical drift over centuries. This is a targeted cleanup operation by someone with root access to the narrative.
Let's look at the first target on their list, the lake battle. This is a massive one.
Oh, this is a classic Fishers of Men. If you've been following the thesis, this is one of those major aha moments.
It really is. Let's look at the Flavian source first, Josephus. We are talking about the Battle of Tarachiae. Josephus sets this battle explicitly at the Lake of Gennesaret.
Which is absolutely crucial. Luke chapter 5, verse 1, uses that exact specific name, Lake of Gennesaret, for the site where Jesus calls his disciples. Not the Sea of Galilee, which is the common, everyday term, but Gennesaret. That is the geographic anchor. It tells the sophisticated reader, hey, pay attention. These two texts are talking about the same place.
And the action. In the Gospels, Jesus says to Peter and Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." On the surface, it's a lovely metaphor for evangelism.
Or so we are told in Sunday school, but in the typological reading, it is a very dark threat. It points back to Jeremiah 16:16. Behold, I will send for many fishers, says the Lord, and they shall fish them. It's a prophecy of military judgment, and in Josephus, Titus fulfills that judgment quite literally.
It's a complete slaughter.
It is a massacre of epic proportions. The Jewish rebels flee out onto the lake in these small, fragile fishing boats. The Romans pursue them on heavy rafts. And Josephus describes it. The detail is stomach-turning. He specifically says the Romans caught them in their ships, they speared them in the water. If they tried to swim away, their heads were cut off, or they were pierced with lances like fish.
The imagery is brutally active. It's a sport to them.
The Romans are the fishermen, and the Jews are the catch. It's the visual punchline to the gospel setup. Jesus promises a catch, and Titus delivers a slaughter.
It's a sickening literalization of the metaphor. It creates this massive cognitive shock for the reader. The good news of catching men becomes the bad news of being slaughtered by Titus.
Okay, so now let's look at the antivirus patch. Let's open the Josippon. What happens to this battle?
Well, first of all, we aren't in Galilee anymore. The Josippon moves the entire event to Jaffa.
Jaffa, on the Mediterranean coast?
Yes.
That is, 60 or 70 miles away? That is not a typo.
Ah.
You don't misspell Galilee and get Jaffa. That is a deliberate relocation program.
It is a totally different ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
But look at how the destruction happens in the Josippon. In Josephus, the Romans are the active agents, right? They are spearing, they are cutting, they are drowning people.
Yes, active fishing.
In the Josippon, the Romans don't even get their feet wet.
What do you mean? How did the Jews die?
The Hebrew text says the rebels fled to the sea in boats. But then it says a great stormy wind rose up, a ruh sarara in Hebrew. And it was the wind that smashed the ships against the rocks.
Wait, so the Romans are just standing on the beach watching this happen?
Effectively, yes. The agency is completely stripped from Titus and his soldiers. He's no longer the fisher of men. He's just a bystander to a natural weather disaster.
But why move it to Jaffa? If you just want to use a storm to strip Titus of his agency, you can have a storm on the Sea of Galilee. We know Galilee has sudden violent storms. The Gospels talk about them all the time. Jesus calms the storm on that very lake.
That is the brilliant part of the patch. Think about how hyperlinks work. If you leave the battle at the Lake of Gennesaret, you still trigger the memory of Luke 5.
Right. The location itself is a trigger.
Exactly. The reader sees Gennesaret and thinks, Jesus, fishers, boats. Even if you change the mechanics of the battle, the location is a hyperlink to the New Testament.
So you have to break the hyperlink.
You have to delete the server entirely. By moving it to Jaffa, to the Great Sea, you sever the connection to the gospel narrative completely. A Jewish reader looking at this text sees a tragedy at sea, sure, but they do not see the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy to Peter.
It's like, imagine if someone wrote a history of the Titanic, but they moved the sinking to the coast of Brazil.
Perfect analogy.
You wouldn't think iceberg. You would just think, you're an accident.
That is exactly the mechanism. It neutralizes the typology. And there's a second, deeper layer here regarding the Hebrew worldview. In Jewish tradition, the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, is deeply associated with chaos and divine judgment. Specifically, it refers back to Jonah.
Oh, wow. Remember where Jonah sailed from when he was fleeing God?
He sailed from Jaffa.
Jaffa. So by moving the disaster there, the Yosippon author is subtly shifting the genre of the text.
Exactly. He is saying this isn't a New Testament fulfillment. This is an Old Testament judgment. It recontextualizes the tragedy into purely Jewish internal theological terms. Titus and his Roman fishing pole are written completely out of the script.
It really is a total disconnect, because to kill the Atwill typology, you need to remove three things. You have to remove the specific lake, you have to remove the active fishing by the soldiers, and you have to break the sequence. And the Josippon breaks all three simultaneously.
And notice what happens to the survivors. In Josephus, the people in the water who survived the spearing are pulled out and executed. In the Josippon, they wash up on shore after the storm, and they are killed on land.
The specific horror of the Josephine text, the water filled with blood, the catching in the deep, is just gone.
Erased. Patched over. Let's move to the next redaction. The Jordan Massacre. This links to the legion and the swine narrative.
Right. The Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, this is another major node in the system. Jesus meets a wild man possessed by a legion of demons.
My name is Legion, for we are many.
Exactly, and the foundational analysis points out that the Roman 10th Fretensis Legion was stationed right in that area during the war, and their actual military mascot was the boar. The pig? So when Jesus casts the legion into the swine and they run violently down a steep bank into the sea, it's a direct foreshadowing of the war. It's military satire dressed up as an exorcism.
The swine represent the Jewish rebels. The legion represents the Roman military power driving them to their destruction.
Correct. The exorcism is the military campaign. Now look at the key in Josephus. We have the Battle of Gadara. The rebels are described explicitly by Josephus as the wildest of wild beasts.
Wild beasts. That perfectly connects to the animalistic, subhuman imagery of the swine in the gospel.
And they are driven by the Romans, specifically by a commander named Placidus, into the Jordan River, where they drown in mass numbers. It is the exact historical event that the swine's story parodies. The Romans drive the beasts into the water.
So how does the Josippon handle this? Do they just delete the battle like they move the lake?
No, they do something much more subtle and, frankly, much more profound. They rewrite the moral character of the victims.
This is where the Josippon almost feels like a direct counter-polemic against Christian theology.
It really is. In Josephus, the victims are hardened fighters. They are wild beasts. They are zealots. You aren't supposed to feel bad for them. They are the bad guys in the Roman narrative.
The Josippon does use the term wild animal or beast elsewhere in the text.
Oh, really? Where?
It reserves that bestial language exclusively for the internal Jewish civil war, when Jews are fighting Jews inside Jerusalem.
The zealots fighting the moderates.
Yes. When Jews kill Jews, the Josippon calls it beastly. But when Romans kill Jews, the Jews are always presented as victims or martyrs, or the poor of the land. Never beasts.
That is such a specific, disciplined editorial choice. It effectively says to the reader, look, we might be sinners, we might be tearing ourselves apart, but we are not demons to be exorcised by Rome. In the Josippon, the text uses a very specific, deeply loaded Hebrew phrase to describe the group Placidus attacks. They call them Daleth Harez.
Daleth Harez. Let's unpack that for the listeners. What does that signify?
It's a biblical term found in Jeremiah and 2 Kings. It literally translates to the poor of the land. It refers to the non-combatants, the peasantry, the vulnerable people left behind when the elites are exiled or killed. It specifically connotes innocence and defenselessness.
So they aren't wild beasts at all. They are refugees.
The Josippon explicitly says Placidus found a great mob of poor people who sought to go up to Jerusalem to find refuge there. These aren't soldiers. They are families. They are the displaced. They are terrified civilians.
That completely flips the script on the Romans.
It is a total moral inversion. Think about it. The gospel typology requires the victims to be demonic swine in order to justify the exorcism.
Yeah.
Jesus, representing Titus, is doing a good thing by driving the swine into the sea. You don't weep for demons. But if the people being driven into the river are innocent, terrified refugees...
Then it's not a miraculous exorcism, it's a war crime.
Exactly. You cannot read the Josippon account and see it as a divine judgment or a righteous cleansing of the land. It becomes a horrific tragedy of innocent life lost. The exorcism reading is completely blocked by establishing the moral innocence of the victims.
And the casualty numbers change, too, in this version, right?
Yes, significantly. The Josippon claims 92,200 people drowned in the river.
92,000. That is way higher than what Josephus reports.
It is intentionally inflated to emphasize the catastrophic scale of civilian loss. It turns the glorious Roman victory into a shameful massacre of the innocent. It's the author screaming across the centuries, "We were not pigs, we were people. We were the poor of the land."
It's incredibly clever. It's not just breaking the textual link, it's shaming the accuser. It's saying, you Christians compare this massacre of our poor to healing a demoniac. You are sick, your theology is sick.
It's reclaiming the moral high ground. It's taking the typological weapon right out of the enemy's hand and turning it back on them to expose their cruelty.
The redactor wants the reader to feel the crushing weight of the innocent dead, not the glory of a Roman victory over rebels.
It prevents the reader from ever accepting the Roman premise that the slaughter was a theological necessity. It effectively de-swines the population.
De-swines. I really like that phrase. It rehumanizes them. And once the victims are human, the Flavian joke stops being funny. It just becomes a horror story.
Speaking of horror stories, we have to go to the heart of darkness now. This is the absolute centerpiece of the Flavian satire. It's arguably the darkest joke in the entire book.
This is the node that usually stops people in their tracks when they first hear about Caesar's Messiah, the cannibal Mary.
It is grotesque.
For anyone who needs a quick refresher, Josephus tells a story about a woman named Mary, trapped during the siege of Jerusalem, who is so mad with hunger that she roasts and eats her own infant son.
It is horrific to read. This is the grand parody of the Eucharist. Take, eat, this is my body. It is the anti-communion meal set during the Passover, just like the Last Supper.
But there's a specific genealogical detail in Josephus that is crucial for the typological mapping. It's about her father.
Yes. In the Jewish War, Josephus doesn't just call her Mary. He introduces her with a very specific, full pedigree. He calls her Mary, daughter of Eleazar, of the village of Bethazab, which signifies the house of hyssop.
Okay, let's break down the triple note here for the audience.
First, we have Mary. Second, we have Eleazar. Now, Eleazar is the Hebrew form of the Greek name Lazarus. It's the exact same name. Third, we have the house of hyssop. Hyssop is the specific plant used in the Passover rituals, and it's heavily featured at the crucifixion. Remember, they put a sponge full of vinegar upon hyssop.
So we have Mary, Lazarus, and hyssop tying it to Passover and the crucifixion.
Which links directly one-to-one with John chapter 12. In John 12, Mary and Lazarus are at a dinner before the Passover.
It's the exact same cast of characters.
Yeah.
In the Gospel, Mary and Lazarus are at a holy dinner celebrating resurrection and life. In Josephus, Mary, who is the daughter of Lazarus, is at an unholy dinner celebrating death and cannibalism.
Exactly. The Josephus story is the anti-fulfillment of that gospel scene. It's deliberately designed to mock the Christian hope of communion and resurrection.
So what does the Josippon do with this highly specific setup?
It performs a surgical excision. It is fascinatingly precise. The Josippon text reads, "There was a woman in Jerusalem, one of the daughters of the gentry. Her name was Miriam, and she was from across the Jordan."
What's missing?
The father's name, daughter of Eleazar, is completely gone.
Just erased.
Just gone. Poof. Now, you have to understand the literary context of the Josippon to see why this is a smoking gun. This is a book that absolutely loves genealogies. It is obsessed with who is the son of whom. It traces lineages all the way back to Adam. It routinely adds names to Roman generals and minor figures that Josephus doesn't even bother to mention.
So it's not like the author was just trying to save valuable parchment ink?
No. He adds trivial details everywhere else in the book, but here, in the one single place where the father's name forms a crucial, load-bearing typological link to the Gospel of John, the name just vanishes.
It cannot be an accident. The probability is basically zero.
It is highly, highly unlikely. Without the name Eleazar, the connection to Lazarus is completely severed. You just have a starving woman named Mary. And Mary, or Miriam, was literally the most common female name in Second Temple Judea. Without the brother or father figure of Lazarus to anchor it, the triple node completely collapses.
You can't make the link to John 12 anymore. It's just a tragic horror story of a siege, not a pointed theological satire.
Precisely. The typology requires all the puzzle pieces to be in place. The Yosippon carefully reaches in and removes the keystone piece.
There's also something about her dialogue, right? The phrase byword to the world.
Yes. In Josephus, before Mary eats her son, she gives this incredibly theatrical speech where she says her act will become a byword to the world, a mythos. It's the Flavian authors basically winking at their Roman audience, saying, hey, we are writing a myth here. This is a story designed for the whole world to read and believe.
Does the Josippon keep that line?
No. The byword to the world line is scrubbed, but interestingly, the word sacrifice actually stays in her speech.
Really? They kept the concept of sacrifice?
Yes, but the context is entirely flipped. In Josephus, it is a direct mockery of the Christian sacrifice of the Eucharist. In Josippon, Mary uses the speech to accuse the Jewish rebel factions. She points to her dead son and says, you caused this famine. You rebels made me do this.
So it shifts from a theological parody mocking Christ to an internal historical critique of the Zealots.
Exactly. It stops being about Jesus and communion and starts being about the grim tragedy of the Jewish Civil War. It neutralizes the Roman satire by regrounding the horror in actual Jewish suffering. It turns a universal weaponized myth into a hyper-local tragedy.
Man, they were thorough. This implies a level of textual awareness, like critical reading comprehension, that mainstream academia usually refuses to credit to medieval scribes.
It implies that they knew exactly what the game was. They knew the Romans were laughing at them through these texts, and they systematically decided to stop the laughter. To argue that random manuscript damage just happened to remove the word Eleazar, the one single name required to make the Lazarus Eucharist connection work, is statistically naive.
It's like firing a shotgun blindly at a wall and having the pellets land in the shape of a perfect smiley face. That's not ballistics, that's art, that's design.
Exactly. The precision implies a clear, conscious intent by the redactors. Let's move to the grand finale of the war. Masada. This is a massive one. The mass suicide.
Right. In Josephus, Masada is the empty tomb parody.
Let's think about the setup for the listener. Eleazar ben Yair leads a suicide pact among the Sicarii.
Right. They realize the Romans are going to breach the wall, so they decide to kill themselves rather than be taken as slaves.
So they kill their families, then each other. They lay the bodies out in neat rows. And then the Romans finally break in. And what do they find?
They find absolute silence. They find the dead in a sort of slumber. And then, and this is the typological key survivors, emerge from the subterranean cisterns. 2 women and 5 children come up from the underground to tell the Romans the story of what happened.
It perfectly mimics the mechanical structure of the resurrection narrative. The stone is rolled away from the fortress, the tomb is empty of living enemies, and witnesses emerge from the earth, from the underground tombs, to testify to the miracle.
Right. It is a resurrection of the dead where everyone is actually just dead. It is the Flavians' final nihilistic mockery of the Christian hope.
And the Josippon, does it dare to rewrite the most famous mass suicide in ancient history?
It rewrites it completely. In the Yosippon's account of Masada, the men do kill their wives and children to save them from Roman slavery. They put them in the cisterns. But the men themselves, they do not commit suicide.
Wait, really? They don't kill themselves?
No. They engage in a final death charge. The text explicitly says they engaged in fighting with the Roman camp, and they died for God and his sanctuary.
They open the gates and charge the Romans. The Hebrew text says they killed many of them without number, and they fight in hand-to-hand combat until the very last Jewish man falls dead on the battlefield.
That is a completely different genre of death. That's not a philosophical stoic exit. That's a Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ending, going down in a blaze of glory.
It creates a powerful martyrdom narrative, what in Jewish tradition is called a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of the name.
There is no silent, eerie discovery by the Roman legionaries. There is no emergence of witnesses from the cisterns to preach the gospel of Masada.
That completely destroys the empty tomb imagery. I mean, you can't have a resurrection parody if the bodies are just piled up in the mud on a battlefield.
It does something else deeply philosophical, too.
Yeah.
It completely removes the noble death philosophy that Josephus inserted.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Josephus puts this very long, flowery, Hellenistic speech in Eleazar's mouth, right before the suicide. A speech about how the soul is liberated by death, how death is actually better than life. It implicitly authorizes the Christian theological idea of death as victory. It sounds very Platonic, very early Christian martyrdom.
And notice the leader, too. In the Josippon, it's Eleazar ben Anani, not ben Yair. And his speech before the end isn't about the nobility of death or the immortality of the soul, which is what Josephus dwells on for pages to sound like a Greek philosopher.
Right, it's very Socratic in Josephus.
But in the Josippon, it's a battle cry. It's just, let's take as many of them with us as we can. It deletes the Christian/Socratic tone of the suicide speech and replaces it with a Maccabean warrior speech. And note the trade-off here, because this is vital. They are willing to sacrifice their own historical accuracy, assuming Josephus' account of the suicide was historically accurate to begin with, in order to destroy the theological overlay. They would rather have their ancestors remembered as dying as fierce warriors than dying passively as props in a Roman resurrection play.
It denies the Romans their clean, cinematic ending. In Josephus, the Romans walk into a silent fortress and win by default. It's an eerie, almost holy victory. In the Josippon, the Romans have to bleed for every single inch of ground. It's brutal.
And structurally, going back to Atwill, it just utterly dismantles the resurrection node. You cannot map the empty tomb onto a chaotic battlefield slaughter. If there is no silence, no rising from the cisterns, the typological link is permanently broken.
Exactly. The empty tomb requires a very specific, quiet choreography. The Josippon looks at that choreography and changes it into a mosh pit.
You know, we've been talking a lot about how the Josippon protects the internal Jewish story, but there's another side to this antivirus. It also goes on the offensive. It actively attacks the Roman narrative, specifically the story of Vespasian himself.
Ah, yes, the star prophecy.
This brings us to what I think is honestly the heaviest lift in the whole Atwill theory, because this isn't just about clever literary parallels in a text. This is about real-world political legitimacy.
It is the foundation to the divine right of kings for the Flavian dynasty. Josephus, in the Jewish War, does something that, honestly, as a Jewish historian writing about his own people, is breathtakingly treacherous.
He gives away the Messiah.
He takes the ancient prophecy from the book of Numbers, chapter 24, a star shall come out of Jacob, a prophecy that absolutely everyone in Judea understood to mean the Jewish political and spiritual Messiah. And Josephus hands it on a silver platter to Vespasian,
The pagan Roman general.
Who is currently in the process of burning Judea to the ground. Josephus writes explicitly that the Jews were foolish and wrong to interpret this oracle as pointing to one of their own. He says the prophecy actually foretold the rise of Vespasian from Judea to become the emperor of Rome.
It is the ultimate propaganda coup. It's Vespasian saying, your God didn't abandon you to the Romans. Your God actually picked me to be your new boss.
It is literal apotheosis. It turns the Flavian military dictatorship into a divinely ordained, biblically prophesied institution. Now, if you are the redactor of the Josippon, writing this Hebrew counterhistory hundreds of years later, you have a massive problem.
Because you can't just ignore Vespasian.
Right, he became the emperor. That is an immovable historical fact.
You can't pretend Rome didn't win.
So how do you handle his meteoric rise to ultimate power without giving him the scar prophecy credit?
Well, the outline notes here say they removed the prophecy, which, okay, that makes basic editorial sense. You just delete the line about the star.
But they did so much more than just delete the line. They completely rewrote the cause of his ascension. And this is where the Josippon gets, well, it gets genuinely funny.
Funny.
Darkly comedic. In Josephus, Vespasian rises because of cosmic destiny. God wills it. In the Josippon, Vespasian rises to the purple because of, essentially, peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Go on.
The Josippon describes a political situation back in Rome. It says the current emperor, Vitellius, was a glutton and a drunkard, a total disgrace to the empire. And the Roman soldiers were just fed up with him. They wanted literally anyone else. So they look over at their general, Vespasian. And does Vespasian stand up heroically and say, I am the star of Jacob, God has chosen me?
I'm guessing not.
No. He shrinks back. He says, I don't want it. He refuses the crown. He's terrified of the responsibility.
And the Roman soldiers literally have to draw their swords and threaten to kill him, rule over us, or die.
That is hilarious. It turns the divine election of the Flavian dynasty into a workplace dispute. It's like, we hate our boss. He's always drunk, so you have to be the boss now. And Vespasian's like, I don't want to. And they're like, do it or we stab you. I love that. It's so petty, but it's so incredibly effective. You're not the Messiah. You're just the designated driver for the Roman Empire.
But hold on, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Is it possible that the Josippon author just I don't know, had a different source for Roman history. Maybe he was reading Suetonius or Tacitus, who might have had less flattering or more pragmatic accounts of the year of the four emperors.
That is a very valid methodological challenge. We know the Josippon compiler had access to various Latin texts, but think about the active choice of which narrative to elevate. If your goal is simply to write an objective history of the Jewish war, you absolutely mention the Star Prophecy because it was a massive documented motivator for the Zealot revolt.
Right. Even if you, as a Jewish author, don't believe the prophecy applied to Vespasian, you have to mention that Josephus claimed it did. It's part of the historical record of the conflict.
Exactly. To leave it out entirely is a highly conscious editorial choice. It's a silencing. By deleting the prophecy and replacing the divine election with a frantic military coup, the Josippon is doing something very specific. It is engaging in deapotheosis.
Deapotheosis. Taking the godhood away.
It is actively arguing to the Jewish reader that Rome's ultimate victory was a gritty political accident, a secular farce, not a theological necessity. It deliberately keeps God out of the Roman camp.
It turns the conquest from a divine will event into a political farce.
Precisely.
We have to talk about the elephant in the room, or, given the context, the lamb in the room. We need to talk about Jesus.
We do, because Atwill's entire foundational point is that Josephus provides the testimonium Flavianum.
That incredibly famous, highly debated passage where Josephus seemingly confirms that Jesus was the Christ, that he was a wise man, that he performed miracles, and that he appeared alive on the third day.
Yes. It is the literary bridge that connects the two text families. It is the handshake between the Roman history and the Christian Gospels.
It effectively baptizes Josephus. It makes the Jewish historian a witness to the gospel truth. It tells the ancient reader, yes, the Jesus of the Gospels is real, and this Roman history book exists in the exact same canonical universe.
So does the Josippon keep it?
I am going to guess that's a hard no.
Absolute hard no. It rips the testimonium out by the roots. But, and this is what's so interesting forensically, it doesn't ignore Jesus completely. It doesn't pretend he didn't exist. It mentions him exactly once in the entire manuscript.
Just once? In what context?
Just once.
Yeah.
And not as a wise man, not as a worker of startling deeds. It mentions him solely to identify his brother James. It refers to James as the brother of the crucified Jesus.
Ouch. The crucified Jesus, not Jesus the Christ. Not the Savior.
Just a genealogical footnote identified purely by his Roman method of execution. It reduces the central figure of Christianity to a dead, state-executed criminal.
He is stripped of all historical agency, all divinity, and all spiritual wisdom. He is just another Roman casualty. That totally burns the bridge, doesn't it? If you are a medieval Jew reading the Yosippon instead of the Greek Josephus, you never get that nod to Christianity. You don't see your own historian validating the other side. You just get a passing reference to a guy who got executed.
It creates a closed circuit for the Jewish reader. There is no theological opening to the gospel narrative. The bridge is permanently out.
And it's not just Jesus they attack, right? They go after the author himself. They aim right at Josephus.
This is, in my opinion, the most devastating part of the entire antivirus protocol. The Josippon engages in absolute, unmitigated character assassination of its own source text's author.
We're talking about the cave at Jaffa, right, where Josephus surrenders to the Romans instead of dying with his men.
Yes. In the Jewish war, Josephus paints his own surrender as a direct act of God's will. He gives this long, pious speech to his men in the cave about how suicide is a grave sin against the Creator and how God has specifically chosen him to live so he can write the history of the war.
He makes himself look like a chosen prophet, like Jeremiah.
Exactly. He survives the suicide pact in the cave by what he calls divine providence. He tricks his men, essentially.
He's the chosen survivor, the soul bearer of truth.
But in the Josippon, the tone is entirely different. It turns the cave scene into a trial. The 40 men trapped in the cave with him put Josephus on trial, and they deliver this blistering, humiliating speech. They call him a traitor to his face.
What do they say?
They say, "You were chosen from a priestly people. You are a leader of Israel, and you can desire to live under these Roman dogs. How can you desire life? You are a disgrace to the priesthood."
They really let him have it.
It's a full prosecution. They accuse him of deep cowardice, of hypocrisy, of loving his own skin more than his God. They completely dismantle his moral and religious authority.
So think about the psychological effect of that on the reader. If you are reading the Josippon from that chapter onward, you aren't reading the objective words of a prophet. You are reading the tainted words of a known collaborator.
Exactly. And that strikes right at the root of the Flavian signature. Because if the narrator is unreliable, if he's been exposed as a coward working for the enemy, then his prophecies about Vespasian and his clever typologies about Titus are instantly recognizable as enemy propaganda.
The Josippon essentially inoculates the reader against trusting anything Josephus says about theology. It says, don't believe this man's spin. He sold us out to save his own life.
It's a masterstroke. It turns the author into the villain of his own book. So let's zoom out for a second and look at the whole board. We've covered a massive list of deviations. The lake battle moved to Jaffa. The Romans are removed from the fishing role, replaced by weather. The Jordan massacre. The wild beasts are turned into the Dalath Hario poor refugees, breaking the demoniac link completely. The cannibal Mary. The father's name Eleazar is deleted, breaking the Lazarus Eucharist link.
The silent suicide is changed to an open kinetic battle, destroying the empty tomb parody.
The star prophecy is deleted, replaced with a reluctant, cowardly coup.
Exposed as a hypocritical traitor by his own men, delegitimizing the source.
Reduced to a single-word footnote, defined by his death.
When you lay it all out like that, it is a comprehensive, systematic dismantling of a theological architecture.
Now, I can hear the skeptics in the audience, the mainstream historians. They're saying, look, you guys are cherry-picking. The Josippon is a long book. Maybe there are 1,000 other random changes that don't fit your neat little Atwill theory. And that is exactly where we have to look at the statistical argument, the forensic rebuttal.
Right, because errors do happen. Ancient texts get corrupted all the time during transmission.
Errors happen, yes, but natural errors are usually random. They're distributed evenly, like static on a radio dial. They happen in the boring genealogical parts of the text just as often as the exciting climactic parts. A sloppy scribe will mess up the date of a minor skirmish just as often as a theological pivot point.
But that is emphatically not what we see here.
No. The divergences in the Josippon are highly concentrated. They cluster specifically and almost exclusively at the structural load-bearing nodes of the Atwill thesis.
It's like the difference between firing a shotgun at a wall and firing a sniper rifle. If you look at a wall and see bullet holes scattered all over the place, top to bottom, it's random. But if you see bullet holes only in the exact center of the forehead of the targets painted on the wall, that is not an accident.
That is the perfect analogy. What are the statistical odds that a sloppy translator would accidentally move the lake battle to Jaffa and accidentally change the victims at the Jordan from wild beasts to the innocent poor and accidentally cut the specific name Eleazar from the cannibal story and accidentally remove the star prophecy, all while leaving the non-typological secular history relatively intact?
The probability is practically negligible.
You cannot patch a computer virus that doesn't exist. The mere fact that the patch is so precise, so targeted, proves that the virus, the Flavian signature, was real. The redactors of the Josippon saw it. They understood how it functioned mechanically, and they went in to surgically remove it.
That is the smoking gun for Caesar's Messiah. The existence of the antivirus proves the existence of the virus.
It does. And it proves that the Jewish intellectuals of the 10th century, or perhaps the oral tradition that preceded them for centuries, were much, much sharper readers of Josephus than modern historians have ever given them credit for. They knew they were looking at a weaponized text.
They understood that the Jewish war wasn't just a sad history of their defeat, it was an active theological assault on their identity. And they wrote a deliberate software patch to neutralize it for future generations.
It's such a fascinating concept to grapple with. Polemic history. We usually think of history simply as a record of what happened, but this analysis suggests history is actually what we need to remember.
Or, perhaps more accurately, how we need to remember it to survive. The Josippon is a cultural shield. It allows a Jewish reader in the Middle Ages to know the tragic history of the destruction of their temple without being spiritually infected by the Christian and Flavian typology that was embedded in the original Greek report.
But before we wrap up, the eschatology of the two texts.
The ending of the story, the final worldview.
The Jewish war has a very clear, very brutal ending. The temple is destroyed. Rome is utterly triumphant. The ancestral line of David is extinguished forever. The Flavian dynasty is presented as the new Zion. It is a closed history.
Josephus essentially tells his readers, God has moved his cosmic headquarters to Italy. Deal with it.
How does the Josippon end its narrative?
It ends with an open door. The final passages of the Hebrew text are not a eulogy for a dead nation. They are a desperate, beautiful prayer.
What does the text actually say?
It says, and I'm translating here, "May it be the will of the God of heaven that he may have compassion upon us and upon his temple, and build it swiftly in our days.
Swiftly in our day.
By including that prayer, the text insists that the story is not over. The true Messiah has not come yet, certainly not Vespasian, and certainly not Jesus. The temple is not permanently replaced by Rome. It is merely in a state of suspension.
It fundamentally rejects the Flavian closure. It refuses to accept that Rome is the end of history.
It keeps the wound open, and in the context of Jewish history and survival, an open wound is much better than a closed scar. A scar means the healing process is finished and the past is over. An open wound means you are still actively fighting to fix it.
The eschatological account, the Josippon, reclaims the future from the Romans.
Correct. It denies Rome the final word.
So for the listener, the person out there who maybe has a copy of Caesar's Messiah on their shelf, or who has been following this whole heterodox historical debate for years, what is the ultimate big takeaway here?
The takeaway is validation. Modern critics constantly accuse Joseph Atwill of parallelomania. They accuse him of finding patterns that aren't really there, of projecting modern conspiracy theories onto ancient, innocent texts.
You're just seeing faces in the clouds. We hear it all the time.
But the Josippon proves definitively that 1,000 years ago, a community of native Hebrew speakers living right in the shadow of Christendom in Italy saw the exact same faces in the clouds that Atwill saw. And they didn't just see them, they feared them enough to write a massive 500-page counter-history just to erase them.
The existence of the patch proves the existence of the virus.
Precisely. You do not spend years building a massive shield if there are no arrows flying at you. The Josippon is the hard, historical proof that the Flavian signature was real, it was recognized by ancient readers, and it was considered highly dangerous.